welcome to Voices of the West. Today we are fortunate to have with us W. Michael Farmer. He is a Spur Award finalist and has won, more Will Rogers medallions than I think I can count on things. But definitely an acknowledged author here with us. And thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's really my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Oh, pleasure too. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into writing Westerns.
Well, I'm a physicist by trade. I have a PhD in physics, and years ago, I lived for about 15 years in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I live in Smithfield, Virginia now, and while I was out there, I was on the White Sands Missile Range quite a bit, and finally heard a story that had been around the Las Cruces area for a long time, which was about the Albert Fountain murders. I don't know if you're familiar with those or not, but Fountain was a big time attorney. He was part of the legislature. He owned a newspaper. He and his wife had 12 children, and in the 1890s there was a major drought in that area. Cattle were overgrazing the Tularosa Basin. The lack of water was wiping out most of the small operators and the big investment barons who sat in towns and let a ranch manage things were going broke because the little operators trying to survive had been mavericking when the cattle really weren't mavericks from the big herds. And so they hired Fountain to be their attorney and to stop all of the apparent rustling that was going on. And Fountain was really good at what he did. He started up around Socorro, New Mexico, on the western side of the Rio Grande, and in one season had sent about 30 small operators to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for 5 or 6 years apiece. And then he was going to start the next season on the eastern side down in the Tularosa Basin, where the muscle man for his biggest Democratic opponent, Albert Fall, had a ranch and was pretty much the leader of the small operators. And Fountain worked assiduously. He had 2 range detectives going through the cattle herds, looking for brands that had been run and what have you. And he finally believed in early 1896 that he had the goods on the man who was the muscle man for Albert Fall, is a man named Oliver Lee, who was a real pistolero. Lee minded his own business, didn't bother anybody. He was kind of a charismatic leader, but he wouldn't put up with nonsense from anybody. And the big time cattle investors were anxious to get rid of him and take over the homesteads for the small operators. Well, Fountain finally decided he had enough evidence, and he had to go from Las Cruces, which is about 40 miles north of El Paso, over to Lincoln County. famous Lincoln County where the Billy the Kid Wars were. And he had gotten several threatening notes that said, if you'll drop this, we'll be friends. If not, you're going to die. And his wife was convinced that if he took their little 8-year-old son named Henry with him, that nobody would attack a grown man with a little boy. And he put her off, and she nagged and nagged. And finally, the day before he was supposed to go, he said, okay, Henry can come if he wants to. Naturally, Henry wanted to. They drove over to Lincoln where the grand jury met. And 3 weeks later, they were coming back. Fountain had got the arrest warrants or paperwork he needed to arrest Lee and several of his friends, and they got just past where White Sands is now. 3 men rode up on the road in front of them, but they were far enough away that they couldn't be seen or couldn't be recognized. And by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was very cold. It was February afternoon, 1st of February. Fountain and his son had disappeared. They were never found. There was posses that came out from Las Cruces. There were Mescalero Apache scouts who came, and they tracked everywhere, but nobody could find them. And everybody that was a Democrat blamed Oliver Lee for doing away with them. There was tremendous pressure on the governor to put Lee in jail, and he brought Pat Garrett out of retirement in Texas. He was trying to grow racehorses, and gave him an exceptional amount of money to gather evidence that would put Lee in jail. Well, 3 years went by, and finally Garrett took his evidence to a grand jury in Las Cruces. They looked at it, and in the words of Albert Fall, who was Lee's attorney, said they didn't have enough evidence to hang a yellow dog. And they wound up having a major trial at a neutral site, the little mining town of Hillsboro, which is about 70 or 80 miles north of Las Cruces. The trial went on for 18 days. They called 75 witnesses, and they finished up the presentations about 11:30 one night. The judge said to the jury, I want you to go get a good night's rest and start first thing in the morning. And Albert Fall jumped up and said, no, I want them to start right now. We're tired of this. So the judge let them start. 8 minutes later, they came back and said not guilty. And to this day, nobody knows who murdered Albert Fountain and what happened to him. Whoever did it set it up so that it looked like Lee would do it or had done it, because the wagon they were in turned out into the desert and then turned toward the Harilla Mountains, where Lee's ranch was. And there are numerous theories about who was behind it. One major one is that the Santa Fe Ring wanted to get rid of both Lee and Fountain, but who knows? So everybody, or not everybody, but most in Las Cruces had their own idea about what had happened. And I had finished a couple of technical books back around 2001, and decided that I would write a little story, try to get it at what might have actually happened to the fountains, and that wound up leading to a lot of research. I pretty much concluded that Lee did not do it. He might have known who did, but he wasn't saying. And there are two or three creditable suspects, I think. But when I started writing, I discovered that I enjoyed it so much, fiction wise, that I just kept on. And when I got through with the little 10,000 word story I wanted to write, I had 180,000 words. And I had created characters that wound up being in several of my future books, and I've spent most of the last 7 or 8 years writing about Mescalero and Chiricahua Apaches who were. There was an Apache scout who was a major character in the first book, and so that's where my work sits now. I'm now working on a couple of books about Apache Kid, who was probably the most feared outlaw in Arizona at the turn of the latest century that was known.
Yeah. I often ask people what comes first, particularly a plot or a character on this, but it seems definitely you're working out of actual historical accounts and research to get to where you want to start.
Yeah, I had read a book by Oakley Hall, and my brain is diminishing, and I can't quite recall the name of it. It was made into a movie, but Oakley Hall was arguably one of the best novelists in the 20th century. And he said in the foreword of the book that the business of fiction was to find the truth and not the facts. And I've since seen a piece about Hilary Mandel, who won a couple of Booker Award prizes for her trilogy on Oliver Cromwell, and she basically said that her approach, and it's the one that I like to think that I use, although I'm sure I don't write nearly as well as she does, but it's to use the history as the skeleton for your story, and be sure that the historical facts are right, and put the meat and sinew on the bones of that with your imagination and fiction.
Definitely. It's a good way to do. You go through the whole thing of doing the framework of plotting out the entire story, or do you just go by the historical narrative from beginning to end of a particular story?
No, I just go by the historical narrative. Early in the first 2 or 3 books that I wrote, I tried to do the outline, and I found that once I started putting meat on the bones, the characters kind of took on a life of their own, and all I had to do was translate what was being whispered in my ear.
Have they ever wanted you to say something other than what was necessarily the historical record?
Yeah, it has, because with the and this is only recently. I have 3 new books that will come out this year. 2 on Chateau, who was Geronimo's number 2 man until they wound up becoming major enemies. and one that is nonfiction that is called an Apache Iliad, which talks about the 10 years before the Geronimo surrendered. But the thing is that there are such big gaps in these things that often you really just have to do a spit in the wind guess about what was there, and there's really no way, or at least I have no access to the records that might change it. For example, the General Crook took an expedition down into Mexico to bring the Chiricahuas back that had left the San Carlos Reservation. This is in 1883, and just about every soldier, quote, quote, that he took was an Apache scout. He took 197 Apache scouts, and he took 40 mounted soldiers, basically to look after the packers who were handling the mules that were carrying his supplies. And the extraordinary thing was that these 197 scouts ran. They didn't ride horses. They ran, starting at the U.S. border all the way into Mexico and back, something like 600 miles. And they would usually outrun the troopers, and they were faster on their feet in the mountains without a horse than with a horse. So now I'm working on the Apache Kid, and he was in a number of battles. And the question is, were the scouts then running, or were they riding horses? I don't know. I think the question about the Big Dry Wash, which was really the last major engagement that the cavalry had with the Apaches in Arizona, I'm guessing that they were on foot, but I don't know. I took it that way because that's what's most likely true.
Yeah, it fits to the rest of what the story is for that, and what the rest of the historical narrative seems to make sense. Yeah, you got to kind of run with what the facts are showing you with that. What advice would you have for a writer starting out that wants to get into doing a historical novel?
Well, the key, I think, to it is the research. If you can find a what's called a reliable set of secondary sources, i.e., histories that have been created, rather than what's called primary source, like newspapers of the time. And if you do enough of that, you'll soon learn that you've got a pretty wide latitude about what you can do with the story, because it's really rare that the primary sources are correct. They're usually badly wrong, and the historical sources, particularly those put out by the military, are strongly biased towards the military point of view. So my advice is do a lot of reading and research first, and learn the way things really work. One of the things that I learned fairly quickly when I started writing about the Apaches was that I had to know what their culture was. You cannot understand what the Apaches did and why they did it until you understand their culture. And once you do that, then the writing becomes quite easy, because you have their motives in front of you.
What really cued you in on doing the Apaches?
In the first book, the little boy who was 8 years old had managed to get away from the murderers and hide out in the desert. There was an Apache scout who was coming along, who happened to see the whole thing. He didn't know what was going on, but he saw that the little boy was the scout's name was Yellow Boy. And the reason he was called Yellow Boy was because he carried a Yellow Boy Henry rifle, and his power, the capital P, was that if he could see you, he could shoot you. And his mission in life, as far as the Apaches were concerned, in supporting his people, was if they found a witch, he was supposed to shoot out their eyes, because when they got to the happy place, a witch with his eyes shot out couldn't see. So they let it go that way. But when I finished the trilogy about the fountains, I was thinking, well, what do I do now? Because the publisher that I had didn't want anything that went past 1920.
Yeah.
And so I decided, well, maybe I will do a prologue to the Fountain Murders by writing a story about the Apache that was in that story. And when I started researching the Mescaleros, I was kind of astounded, because they had been forced onto wasn't a reservation, although General Carleton, who had forced them onto it at Bosque Redondo near Fort Sumner in New Mexico, decided that they had to stay there. He had promised them that this was their reservation. Well, when Kit Carson went out and started kicking the Navajos' tail and taking all of these prisoners of war, Carleton just shoved them down to Bosque Redondo, and things got really bad fast. The Apaches or the Mescaleros had been sent there in early 1863. By 1865, there was something like 3,000 or 4,000 there. The original Apaches, the Mescaleros, there were only about 500, and the remainder were the Navajos. And things were so bad. This had originally it was called Bosque Redondo because it was kind of a round, circular place the river made with trees and what have you. And it would just about support the Mescaleros. But they had such problems trying to raise crops that they were literally close to starvation, and Carleton would not let them go out and hunt on their own. So in one night, in November, I think it's November the 3rd, 500 Apaches disappeared from under the noses of the U.S. Army. Just gone. They finally started reappearing when General or President Grant said, "Okay, you can have this reservation at Mescalero, or what's now called Mescalero, close to Ruidoso, New Mexico." And they took it. Excuse me. They took it from there, and that was the life and work of this young boy who was an old grown man in the first book. was really enjoyable to create, and that's why I wound up reading as much as I have about the Apaches.
Very good and all that. What would be one particular story, one particular aspect of the West that you've always wanted to tell stories about but haven't as yet? Or basically goes to what are you writing next after whatever you're writing right now?
Yeah. uh, I have got a book that I started, but I got pressured to do the Apache Kid book. Um, in the original Fountain trilogy, the little boy came of age with Yellow Boy in the Sierra Madre in Mexico, and the story is that there were a lot of Apaches hiding in Mexico at the time, and some say they're still there. Excuse me just a second. In fact, when Geronimo surrendered, the army says, "Okay, that's the end of the Apache Wars." Well, in fact, there were still Apache raids in the United States as late as 1930. And they were coming out. They were coming out of the Sierra Madre in Mexico, and so I'm going to do a book about what happened to those Apaches.
Mm-hmm.
And as you work on these things historically, you always run across these little nuggets that sometimes they can wind up being a pretty good chunk of polished gold if you pursue it.
Very good. Excuse me, my turn now. What is the most valuable piece of advice you can give about writing?
Cheeks in the seat. You need to. You need to. There are two things you need to write every day. I've heard this from much more successful authors than me. You need to write every day, and you need to read other work, and you need to be able to read that other work with some sense of what the author is doing and why he did things that way. And I'm retired now, thank goodness, and I can do pretty much what I want, and the trick is to write and read, and not just 600,000 words a year pulp fiction, but the good stuff. You need to read to learn from the really good writers. I guess I want to say Zane Grey, but I know that really Zane Grey's wife was the one that really helped make his fiction what it was. He would knock out a story, and she would go back and fix it up so that it was logical and used good English. But you really need to read and write. I wind up usually reading about an hour a day fiction, and I'll usually write 6 to 8 hours a day, just about every day.
That's impressive. It's hard to maintain every day.
Well, it is until you get hooked with your writing. I was just amazed with my first book at how much I enjoyed writing the fiction. You know, I couldn't wait to sit down and write some more. And often it was you had to do a major edit on a lot of stuff, which I did. And I got real lucky by about my third or fourth book. I found an editor who was not reluctant to tell me, well, this really sucks. You know, you need to get in there and put some action in it, and or a little internal feeling and what have you. And I found my work improved significantly after I started doing that.
Very good. Where can readers discover more about you?
I have a website, wmichaelfarmer.com, and it has my books, podcasts, the usual media stuff, and you'll find a bio in there.
Very good. And generally in Amazon and most major booksellers?
Yeah, Amazon. When I first published, I started out at about 60. I was 60 years old when I first published. And I had sent lots of query letters to agents and publishers and what have you, which I well knew would probably wind up in the slush pile, and got very little response. And I said, well, I'm not going to sit around until I'm 90 to see somebody publish my work. So the first couple of books I had, I self-published using a company that's no longer in business, but they did a pretty good job then, I thought, Lumina Press. And but once you can get a corporate support, if you will, that will help you in your publishing, then that's the best way, in my humble opinion.
Absolutely. Anything that lets you do the writing and be able to focus on that and not worry about the rest of it is a very good thing.
Yes, it is.
Well, thank you for joining me today. Appreciate the time you've taken to be able to be interviewed and learning a little bit about General Apaches and everything else that you're working on there. I'm looking forward to what your next books are going to be.
Wonderful. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you so much.